Let's now look at nervous tissue. So the whole purpose of nervous tissue is for communication. Nervous tissue allows for us to communicate with other aspects of the nervous system, to communicate with muscles, and to communicate with glands. So you could basically say, as a communication network, it communicates with other neurons, muscles, and glands. That's its job. Now, importantly, the primary cell of the nervous system is something called a neuron, which I'm sure you've heard before. Something called a neuron. Now, if I were to draw a neuron up, now all neurons look quite different from one another. And I'm just going to draw, and you're going to look at this and go, wow, this is quite strange looking, but this is the best I can do because I'm not very good at drawing. So this is a generic version of a neuron. Now they don't all look like this, but this is what we're going to use for our example. Now what can we see here? Couple of things. First thing is up here, we've got these things. Now these things are called dendrites. And what dendrites or neurons do is they receive signals. So they receive information from other neurons, for example, or whatever it may be in the area. They might just receive other chemicals that have been released to trigger them or inhibit them, or neurotransmitters, or whatever it may be. Dendrites receive information. Here we've got the cell body. So all in here is the cell body. Now the cell body is basically no different to the cell of any tissue of the body, where it contains a nucleus, which is this thing here that contains DNA, but it's also going to have organelles, right? So organelles like mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum, smooth and rough, and it's going to have vesicles and lysosomes and a whole bunch of different organelles that sit within the cell body. Then you've got this real long thing called the axon. So this structure here is called the axon. A-X-O-N. And the axon is like the highway. It sends the signal, right? So we receive the signal from the dendrites, it decides what it wants to do, and it wants to send the signal down the highway, down the axon, all the way to the end where we've got what we call the axon terminals. So these structures here, axon terminals. And sometimes they're called bulbs. Now the axon terminals are going to speak either to another neuron, or they're going to speak to muscle tissue or glands. So it's the axon terminals, like we listed up above here, that speak to other neurons, they'll speak to muscles, or they'll speak to glands to tell it to release some sort of hormones or maybe some sort of substance that it's produced. And this is a neuron, right? So really important. Now a couple of things is that neurons can also have these wrappings around them. These wrappings like this. And these wrappings are like the rubber coating of a wire. Now think about what that means. When you've got a wire that's gone from, let's say, your television to your sound system, if that rubber coating has been worn away, that signal can be lost. The electrical signal that moves through the wire can be disrupted. And the same thing happens for neurons. If you've got a disease called multiple sclerosis, well, what happens is that these rubber coatings start to get destroyed. And if they disappear, then the electrical signal isn't that good. And so the signal doesn't transmit from one end of the neuron to the other very well, and you can have disruptions in the way your muscles work, disruptions in sending signals fast enough, and so forth. And again, this can be a product of multiple sclerosis. So that is neurons, but I want to talk about the other tissues, or I should say the other cells of the nervous tissue very quickly, called glia. Now glia is Greek for glue. And so these cells are there, they're the glue of the nervous system. They hold neurons together, they talk to neurons, they look after the environment that the neurons live in. And these are glia, and there's many different types. So if we first look at glia within the central nervous system. So let's take a look at glia of the central nervous system. There's a couple of different types. First of which is we have something called oligodendrocytes. Now, oligodendrocytes are that rubber coating. They're that wrapping that wraps neurons. And the term that we use isn't wrapping, or it's obviously not a rubber coating. It's actually made up predominantly of fatty tissue. But these oligodendrocytes, they form something called myelin, often known as a myelin sheath. And it's that myelin sheath that, again, wraps around neurons. Now, we're in the central nervous system, so they wrap around neurons in the central nervous system. So that's the brain, brainstem, cerebellum, and spinal cord. And the way oligodendrocytes do this is if I were to draw up a small example of a neuron, so there's a neuron, and let's draw up another neuron here. What the oligodendrocytes do is they wrap like this. So here's the soma, or the cell body of the oligodendrocyte, and it's got these arms that come out to form the wrappings. And that's how the oligodendrocytes work in the central nervous system. So that's one type of glia. Another type of glia in the central nervous system is that of astrocytes. Now I'm going to wipe off this neuron just so I've got more room. Let's now take a look at astrocytes. Now, cyte we know means cell. Astro means star. These neurons actually look like stars. Now, I shouldn't say neurons, they're glia obviously, I apologize. These astrocytes, which are glia, they look like stars. And their whole purpose is to maintain the environment. Maintain the neuron's environment. And so they do this by making sure that all the nutrients are available, that there's not too many metabolites that could potentially be toxic. They also have important conversations. They release chemicals and substances for neurons. So if you think of neurons like the race car or the race car driver, the astrocytes are going to be the pit crew, helping them out. They also form a very important part of the blood-brain barrier. So the blood is separated from the brain through a barrier because we don't want, if you've got toxins or drugs in the bloodstream, you don't want them to easily get to the brain to cause damage. So astrocytes, they are part of this blood-brain barrier to stop it. Another cell type, or I should say neuron that sits, glia, I gotta say, I apologize again, that sit within the central nervous system are ependymal cells. Ependymal. Now, ependymal cells look like this, right? They actually are epithelia, and we've spoken about epithelia. They're ciliated epithelia. So they've got these arms that are called cilia, right? And they are epithelia. So they are epithelial glia. Now, what's the importance of these? Well, think about this. If you've got the brain, so if we have a look, draw the brain up like this, right? Inside, deep within the brain, you've got these strange looking structures, these hollowed out structures that look like this. Like that. And they move through the deep aspect of the brain, they move through the brain stem, and they move through the cerebellum like this. So these hollowed out structures are called ventricles. And you've got two lateral ventricles, you've got a third ventricle, and you've got a fourth ventricle. They're hollowed out structures, but inside these structures, lining the walls of these structures, I'll do it in red, you've got ependymal cells. So they're the ependymal cells. And what they do is they filter the blood to make cerebral spinal fluid. And cerebral spinal fluid will circulate through the ventricles, right? And they circulate through various layers of the brain and brainstem and spinal cord to replenish the environment, Get rid of any metabolites that may have built up throughout the night. Your cerebrospinal fluid volume increases in the middle of the night to tell us that we're washing away all the things that were built up throughout the day to get rid of it. One of the reasons why you feel groggy if you haven't had a long sleep is because your cerebrospinal fluid hasn't had enough time to wash away all the stuff that should have been washed away throughout the night. So that's ependymal cells. Now the last glial cell I want to talk about in the central nervous system is microglia. Microglia. And what I might do is separate these out for you like this. So microglia. Micro, small glia is the supporting cells. They're little, what we call phagocytic cells. They like to eat and they're small. And so they are there to engulf. So phagocytic. So they eat. They eat anything that shouldn't be there. So they're an immune cell. They're there to help protect the neurons from any invading pathogens or things that should not be there. Okay, finally, peripheral nervous system. If we look at the peripheral nervous system, there are two glia that you need to be aware of. So let's now take a look at the peripheral nervous system. First of which is something called a Schwann cell. Schwann cell. Schwann. Okay, so Schwann cells are the oligodendrocytes of the peripheral nervous system. So if I were to have, again, draw up these neurons like I drew up before, there's one neuron, there's another neuron, and you see, okay, I know how the oligodendrocytes work, how the Schwann cells work. Well, each Schwann cell forms a single myelin sheath. So that's it. So it's not like the other where you've got these arms that project Schwann cells. Each Schwann cell actually forms an individual aspect of the myelin sheath. So again, myelin sheath. Okay, and then last is a satellite cell. Now the satellite cells form a myelin sheath as well, but they do this in the peripheral nervous system. If you look at a sensory nerve, a nerve that allows for us to pick up touch or pain or pressure, for example, they look like this. So that's the soma, right? And it looks very different to what I drew up before. Have a look at the strange axons that are present. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, we have satellite cells that actually form the myelin sheath around the soma, just as a way to protect it. So I'll write down myelin sheath again. And there we go. This is nervous tissue. These are the different cells.